Sir, do you have a moment?
The blue and red lights tore through the dark like a blade. Miles Cole's hands gripped the leather steering wheel at 10 and 2, knuckles whitening against the faint glow of his dashboard. He wasn't speeding. Not tonight. Not ever at this hour. Gravel crunched as the patrol car stopped behind him. The flashing lights painted the quiet suburban street in feverish pulses of color. A dog barked somewhere down the block, then fell silent. The officer approached slowly, like a man walking toward something he already owned. Thick boots, heavy steps, the sound struck like a drumbeat. Miles rolled down his window. Cool air slid into the car. He heard the officer unclip the holster before a word was spoken. License and registration. The officer said, voice flat, practiced. Miles passed them through the open window. The officer didn't look at the documents right away. His gaze traveled over Miles's face, shoulders, the dark suit and silk tie. Everything but the papers. Where exactly are you heading, sir? Home, Miles said, steady. The officer tilted his head, a small smile bending the corner of his mouth. You don't look like you live here. The silence after the line was a blade in the dark. The flashlight beam shifted deliberately toward the glove box, then back to Miles's hands. No movement. Two more squad cars turned the corner, lights splashing against the hood like heat. Miles didn't move. He didn't blink. His badge lay in the briefcase on the passenger seat, still closed, and the officer's hand was already resting on the gun. The first flash of blue light landed on the rearview mirror like a threat. Miles Cole inhaled once, slowly, let his hands find the wheel at 10 and 2, steady as a metronome. Me. The tires crunched against the shoulder as he eased the car to a stop. The neighborhood was quiet. Trees stood in sharp silhouettes against sodium streetlights. Boots hit the pavement. Measured steps. Officer Trent leaned down to the open window with a flashlight bright enough to bleach the night. License and registration. Miles handed both over without a word. His pulse remained steady, trained over years of courtroom tension. Trent tilted the light deliberately across his face, then down to the suit jacket. Where you heading? Home. You live around here? Yes. Trent's gaze flicked toward the house-lined street. Nice neighborhood. Not many folks like you around. The words were calm, polished, not a snarl. That made them worse. Another squad car arrived, then another. Trent returned the light to Miles's face. Step out of the vehicle. I haven't broken any law, Miles said. His voice didn't rise. Trent's hand rested lightly on his holster. Step out, now. The second officer moved to the passenger side. A third stood behind, hands loose at the belt. Miles unlocked the door. Cold night air cut into the car as he stepped out slowly. Hands visible. Trent circled him like a man who already owned the ending. What's in the briefcase? Legal documents. You, a lawyer or something? State attorney, Miles said. Trent's lip twitched. Not surprise, not respect, just something between disbelief and disdain. Sure you are. He waved the others forward. The flashlight beam swept over Miles's shoulders, back, hands. Every movement was choreographed dominance. You got ID to prove that? It's in the briefcase. Passenger seat. Trent didn't move to retrieve it. Then, I guess it's not real. The words dropped like stones in the dark. The radio crackled. One of the officers shifted his stance. Miles stared straight ahead. Calm wasn't safety. Calm was armor. The cuffs clicked around his wrists. Cold metal bit skin. Trent leaned close, voice low. You don't look like any state attorney I've ever seen. Cameras flashed from across the street. A porch light turned on. Someone was recording. Trent didn't look away from Miles's face. He smiled and tightened the cuffs. The curb dug into the back of Miles's legs as they pushed him down. Concrete was cold through the thin fabric of his suit pants. The night hummed with the low static of police radios and the distant, murmured voices of neighbors gathering behind curtains. Trent's boots stopped inches from his face. Keep your hands where I can see them. They're cuffed, Miles said evenly. Trent crouched, flashlight close enough to burn against his skin. Then don't make me regret trusting you to breathe. Two more officers lingered behind him. One shifted uneasily. The other adjusted his vest. Watching like this was a rehearsal he'd seen too many times. Miles angled his chin upward. My identification is in the briefcase. Passenger seat. Trent tilted his head. And why should I care? Because I am the state attorney of this county. The younger officer's shoulders stiffened. Trent didn't flinch. He laughed once, dry. That's cute. You people always got a story. The line hung in the air like smoke. Someone across the street whispered, then raised their phone higher. Trent motioned for a search. One officer opened the passenger door and yanked out the briefcase. Leather hit asphalt. Papers scattered into the gutter like fallen leaves. Miles kept his spine straight. He refused to look down. Trent crouched again, a breath away. You think saying a fancy title gets you out of this? Not tonight. The younger officer cleared his throat. Sir, the ID looks real. Trent's glare cut like glass. And anyone can print something that looks real. Don't go soft. For a moment, the younger man's hands twitched like he might step back. He, DIDN single quotes, T. Miles spoke slowly, each syllable deliberate. You're making a mistake. Trent leaned in closer, voice dropping to a whisper. The mistake is thinking that matters. The radio crackled. A supervisor's voice cut through. Unit 214. What's your status? Got a suspect detained. Trent answered without hesitation. Suspicious vehicle, possible falsified credentials. The younger officer flinched at the word suspect. Miles didn't move. He'd heard that tone in courtrooms. The casual way lies were sewn into records. Across the street, more phones were out now. A woman called quietly to someone inside. The supervisor arrived minutes later, stepping from an SUV with the weight of practiced authority. Captain Reynolds, gray at the temples, sharp eyes. He looked down at Miles, then up at Trent. What's going on? Pulled him over. He claimed he's the state attorney. ID looks fake. Reynolds glanced at the scattered papers, then at Miles's face. His jaw tightened, not at the injustice, but at the mess. Get him up. Miles rose slowly, metal biting his wrists. Reynolds circled him once, eyes hard. If this is real, you're going to make a lot of people uncomfortable. If it's not, you just made the biggest mistake of your life. Trent smirked. Told you, always a story. The cameras across the street zoomed in. Reynolds didn't release the cuffs. He didn't apologize. He nodded to the officers, his voice clipped. Take him in for verification. No one said probable cause. No one said unlawful stop. They pushed him toward the car as the neighborhood watched. The last thing Miles saw, before the door closed, was Trent grinning like a man who thought the world had already chosen his side. Fluorescent light flickered against cracked ceiling tiles. The holding area smelled of burnt coffee, stale sweat, and disinfectant trying too hard. Miles sat on a metal chair, wrists raw from the cuffs. A fingerprint scanner beeped behind him. The desk sergeant typed lazily. No one looked him in the eye. Trent leaned against the doorframe like a man on break. Not one who had just arrested the chief prosecutor in the county he worked in. State attorney, huh? His voice carried an unearned amusement. Must have been fun playing important. Miles didn't respond. Cat got your tongue. Trent stepped closer, the room shrinking around his shadow. You people love speeches. Reynolds entered, closing the door behind him. No smile. We're verifying everything. Stay quiet. Miles locked eyes with him. You've had my credentials for 40 minutes. You already know it's real. Reynolds's jaw shifted. We have procedure. Procedure doesn't involve fabricating charges on the radio, Miles said evenly. Trent's laugh cut the air. Oh, that miscommunication happens all the time. Not to men who look like you, Miles replied. The room stilled. Even the typing stopped. Reynolds crossed his arms. Watch it. Counsel, you're not in court here. Miles straightened. No, I'm in a police station, in handcuffs, for driving home after work. The sergeant at the desk cleared his throat. The ID came back valid. He's who he says he is. No apology followed. No immediate release. Trent stared at him with that same dry grin. Miles stepped through the back door flanked by 2 officers, still cuffed. The crowd roared not in applause, but in the charged, brittle way crowds do when a lie has started to crack. Trent stiffened beside him. Reynolds kept his jaw clenched, calculating. A reporter yelled, Mr. Cole, is it true you're the state attorney? Another, were you profiled tonight? Miles didn't answer. Not yet, Trent hissed under his breath. Don't speak. Miles glanced at him with quiet precision. You already wrote your story for me. Now I'll tell mine. The microphones surged forward. He lifted his wrist slightly. The flash caught on the steel. Gasps rippled through the crowd as faces registered who stood before them, the highest legal authority in the county, paraded like a criminal. Reynolds barked at the officers to move him faster. Cameras followed. Inside the station, Trent paced the hallway. They weren't supposed to find out this fast. Reynolds snapped, Shut up. The sergeant murmured from behind the desk, We've got statements from at least 3 neighbors, 2 videos. It's already on national feeds. Reynolds pressed a hand against his temple. Then, we control it. Miles was uncuffed in a small conference room, but no apology came. No acknowledgement of wrongdoing, just silence thick with self-preservation. The door opened. A woman in a sharp navy suit entered, her stride precise, voice cutting clean through the room. Dana Perez, Deputy State Attorney. Miles, his breath eased a fraction. She turned her glare on Reynolds. You're aware that you've just unlawfully detained the state attorney of this jurisdiction. I hope your pension's worth what's coming. Reynolds folded his arms. We followed procedure. Dana stepped closer. Procedure doesn't involve lying on dispatch, and it sure as hell doesn't involve assaulting the top prosecutor for existing in a black body. The words detonated. Trent, lingering by the door, muttered, "Watch your tone." She pivoted on him like a blade. "Say one more word." The silence after was heavier than any siren. Outside, chants rose organized now. Civil rights groups had already mobilized. Miles straightened his tie. Bruises blooming under his collarbone like unwanted evidence. "You've made this public. You've left a trail you can't scrub." Reynolds leaned in. "You think power shifts because a few phones were on. It doesn't need to shift," Miles said. "It only needs light." Dana touched his arm. "We're filing internal complaints and injunctions before morning. They've boxed themselves in." Reynolds exhaled slowly, realizing the tide wasn't in his favor. But he didn't back down. "Not yet. You're not untouchable," he muttered. Miles's gaze was steady. "Neither are you." Outside, the chants grew louder. Inside, the machine that once operated in darkness began to fracture under a single, unplanned spotlight. Miles was uncuffed in a small conference room, but no apology came, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, just silence thick with self-preservation. The door opened. A woman in a sharp navy suit entered, her stride precise, voice cutting clean through the room. Dana Perez, Deputy State Attorney. Miles. His breath eased a fraction. She turned her glare on Reynolds. "You're aware that you've just unlawfully detained the state attorney of this jurisdiction. I hope your pension's worth what's coming." Reynolds folded his arms. We followed procedure. Dana stepped closer. "Procedure doesn't involve lying on dispatch, and it sure as hell doesn't involve assaulting the top prosecutor for existing in a black body." The words detonated. Trent, lingering by the door, muttered, "Watch your tone." She pivoted on him like a blade. "Say one more word." The silence after was heavier than any siren. Outside, chants rose organized. Now, civil rights groups had already mobilized. Miles straightened his tie. Bruises blooming under his collarbone like unwanted evidence. "You've made this public. You've left a trail you can't scrub." Reynolds leaned in. "You think power shifts because a few phones were on. It doesn't need to shift," Miles said. "It only needs light." Dana touched his arm. "We're filing internal complaints and injunctions before morning. They've boxed themselves in." Reynolds exhaled slowly, realizing the tide wasn't in his favor, but he didn't back down. "Not yet. You're not untouchable," he muttered. Miles's gaze was steady. "Neither are you." Outside, the chants grew louder. Inside, the machine that once operated in darkness began to fracture under a single, unplanned spotlight. The briefing room smelled of coffee burned down to its last bitter inch. Reporters filled every seat. Cameras stood shoulder to shoulder, humming. A podium waited under the county seal like a stage built for someone else's performance. Reynolds adjusted his collar. Face tight, he stood behind the podium while Trent hovered off to the side, uniform sharp, hands locked behind his back. The department's PR officer whispered last-minute lines meant to contain a wildfire already out of their hands. Across town, Miles entered the courthouse through a side entrance. A security guard straightened instinctively. No handcuffs this time. He walked flanked by Dana and two other senior attorneys, posture unbroken. Back at the station, the first reporter spoke. "Captain Reynolds, why was the state attorney handcuffed and detained?" Reynolds gripped the podium edge. "The officers involved acted on what they perceived as suspicious behavior. Identification was presented but required verification. Our priority is public safety." Lies, layered cleanly. "Was he profiled?" Another reporter shouted. "Race played no role in the stop," Reynolds answered, rehearsed and dry. Miles watched the broadcast from the courthouse conference room. His jaw tightened. Dana leaned forward. "They're trying to neutralize it, frame it as procedural," Miles replied evenly. "Then we make the procedure itself the story." She slid folders across the table. Internal affairs filings, civil rights complaints, Press statements already drafted. We're filing everything in the morning. No backroom deal. Outside, protesters gathered at the courthouse steps, chants layered over the sirens, forming something that no briefing could drown out. In the station hallway, Trent paced like a man tasting the edge of something sharp. They'll forget. A few days and it's gone. Reynolds stared at him. No, not this one. Inside the conference room, Miles faced a small team of civil rights lawyers, community leaders, and one federal liaison already dispatched. The machine had shifted. What began as a single traffic stop now sat under national scrutiny. Dana spread photos of the scene. Dashcam, bodycam, livestream, 3 separate angles. Every lie they told collapses under one playback. Miles spoke quietly. Not for theater, but for precision. They built a system that counts on silence, so we'll make silence impossible. Back at the station, a reporter asked Reynolds, "Is Officer Trent facing suspension?" Reynolds' jaw locked. "The matter is under review." Outside the building, a new chant surged. "Say his name." It wasn't just about Miles anymore. It was about every man who didn't have his title. Trent looked out the window at the crowd. For the first time, the smirk that had carried him through the night didn't return. The machine wasn't collapsing. It was turning slowly, dangerously, publicly. The air inside the precinct was brittle. Every conversation was hushed, clipped. The night shift officers avoided eye contact with Trent. Even the hallway chatter that usually filled the space had evaporated into something colder. In Reynolds's office, the blinds were half closed. A muted TV played a national news broadcast dissecting every frame of the arrest video. Miles's face filled the screen, steady under flashing lights, wrists in steel. A lower third banner read, "State Attorney detained in racially charged up." Trent paced the corner. "They're blowing this out of proportion." Reynolds didn't look up from the desk. "No, you handed them a loaded gun and smiled while they pulled the trigger." She mouthed off. Trent snapped. "They always do." Reynolds's eyes cut to him sharp. "Lethal. He is not they. He's the highest legal officer in this jurisdiction." Trent leaned against the wall, jaw tight. "We've gotten away with worse." "Not this time," Reynolds said flatly. In another part of town, Miles stood in his office, jacket off, shirt sleeves rolled. Dana scrolled through legal filings spread across the table. The city outside was lit up in protest signs and phone lights. "They've requested an emergency session with the oversight board," Dana said. "They'll try to shield him," Miles replied. She nodded. "We'll make it public before they can." He paused, fingers pressed against the glass of his office window. "This isn't just about me." "It never was," she said. Back at the precinct, Internal Affairs entered through the main doors. No greetings, no smiles. 4 of them, crisp suits, clipped badges. The room quieted like someone had cut power. Trent stiffened when they called his name. "You're placing me on suspension," he barked. The lead investigator's voice was calm, surgical. "Pending formal inquiry and disciplinary proceedings. You'll surrender your weapon and badge." He scoffed, stepping back. "You can't," Reynolds interrupted, voice low. "Do it." The sound of the gun and badge being placed on the desk was small but final. Outside, the crowd swelled again. Protesters had gathered at the steps of City Hall, now coordinated. The narrative was no longer theirs to contain. Dana briefed Miles on media responses. "They're trying to paint it as a misunderstanding, a procedural error. They want the story to die quietly." Miles met her gaze. "Then, we won't let it." In the hallway outside Reynolds's office, Trent's voice cracked through the walls. "You think I'm going down alone?" Reynolds's silence said more than words could. The machine had started turning on its own operators, and for the first time, Trent realized the weight of being disposable inside the very system he'd always served. The Oversight Board chamber was built for theater disguised as bureaucracy. Long mahogany tables, flags, seated power arranged in a clean semicircle. Cameras lined the back wall. The session was public by necessity, not by choice. Miles sat at the front, not as a defendant, not as a witness, but as the state attorney filing formal misconduct charges. Dana sat beside him, stacks of evidence methodically arranged. The low hum of whispers filled the air. Reynolds sat 2 rows back, jaw locked. Trent sat alone, at a separate table, stripped of his badge and uniform, wearing a civilian suit that didn't fit. His hands twitched, not out of fear, but because for the first time he had no shield. The chairwoman banged the gavel. "This hearing is in session regarding the traffic stop and detainment of State Attorney Miles Cole. All testimony is under oath." The first playback began. Dashcam footage, blue and red lights flooding the night. Trent's voice sharp, practiced. Miles's calm refusal to break. Every pause, every lie, every procedural violation played in sterile, clinical sound. The room didn't breathe. Dana's voice cut the silence. This isn't a misunderstanding. This is targeted profiling, followed by unlawful detention, fabrication of radio reports, and deliberate escalation. And it isn't isolated. She placed a second folder on the table. Officer Trent has 8 prior complaints, all buried. The murmurs swelled. Trent shifted forward. You're twisting everything. Quiet, the chairwoman snapped. Miles's voice followed, steady. I'm not here because of what happened to me. I'm here because it happens to people without my title every day. They don't get hearings. They get buried under paperwork no one reads. The words cut through the chamber. The board questioned Trent, then Reynolds. Reynolds' answers were tight, controlled. Trent cracked fast, his voice rising, tone slipping from confidence to panic. We're the line between order and chaos, Dana interrupted cleanly. You were the chaos. The room fell silent again. An oversight member leaned forward. Captain Reynolds, why was the state attorney not immediately released once his identity was verified? Reynolds hesitated. That hesitation was its own indictment. Another member added. And why did the dispatch record reflect a suspect with falsified credentials? Reynolds exhaled. Slow. It was Miss. Dana pushed a document toward the board. No, it was standard practice. The chairwoman's gaze was cold. Officer Trent, effective immediately. You are terminated from the department. This board is also recommending formal criminal charges. Trent's face went blank, like someone had ripped out the scaffolding he'd built his life on. She turned to Reynolds. And as for you, Captain, your command is suspended pending full federal investigation. The gavel struck once. Outside, the crowd was larger than ever. The decision spread faster than they could contain it. This was no isolated case. It was a crack splitting through stone. Miles stepped outside into the flood of microphones and chants. Dana at his shoulder. Reporters shouted. Cameras flashed. He didn't grandstand. He said one line, clear and precise. Power doesn't disappear when exposed. It shifts. And for once, it had shifted away from the men who thought they'd always owned the night. Rain hit the courthouse steps in fine, cold sheets. The crowd didn't leave. Umbrellas opened like a field of dark wings. News vans idled with engines humming. Protest signs softened in the wet but didn't lower. Trent walked out of the back exit in civilian clothes, escorted by internal affairs. His face was drawn tight, stripped of the swagger that once filled every step. A reporter shouted his name. He didn't turn. He kept walking, jaw clenched, hands shaking just enough to betray him. Across town, Reynolds sat alone in his office, boxers half-packed. His badge lay on the desk in front of him, small and irrelevant now. Outside the glass wall, officers pretended not to look. The machine he had fed for years no longer looked at him like a commander. It looked at him like a liability. Miles stood on the courthouse balcony, looking down at the crowd. Dana joined him. The governor called. Federal investigation starts Monday. He nodded once. Good, they're trying to offer quiet settlements. By time, protect the structure. That's what they always do, Miles said. She looked at him. You know, this isn't the end. It's never the end, he replied. Inside, legal teams drafted follow-up actions, civil rights suits, department reviews, reforms under pressure. What began as one traffic stop had forced cracks through an entire institution. The machine wasn't dismantled, but it could no longer pretend it was clean. Down below, a young man held a sign high. No title should be required to be treated like a human. The crowd roared. Reynolds lifted the badge one last time, then placed it in the box. He knew exactly how the system treated those it no longer needed. Trent sat in a holding room, lawyer at his side, realizing for the first time that the system he'd served wouldn't protect him. He was a piece, not a pillar. Miles descended the courthouse steps slowly, through the chanting and flashing cameras. His face was steady, but the weight beneath his ribs didn't ease. Victories like this were never victories. They were temporary holds against something older, colder, more patient. Dana walked beside him. They'll rewrite the narrative. They always do, he answered, voice low. Then we keep the original. The cameras followed him into the rain. For once, the system didn't get to bury the story. It had to live with it. The house was quiet. No cameras. No chants. No statements. Miles sat alone at his kitchen table, suit jacket still draped over the back of the chair. A half-empty glass of water reflected the low kitchen light like a thin line of steel dot. The adrenaline that had carried him through the hearings, the press, the protests had finally burned out. What remained was weight, clean, cold, unforgiving. His phone vibrated with messages. Dana, civil rights lawyers, reporters, national networks, federal liaisons. He turned it over. Screen down. Outside, rain continued. His wrists still bore the faint red marks from the cuffs. They hadn't faded. The body remembers what the headlines forget. He closed his eyes. The memory replayed without permission. Flashing lights, Trent's voice, the quiet humiliation in Reynolds' silence, the sound of leather against asphalt. This wasn't justice. It was exposure. A wound forced into the light, and wounds, no matter how public, still bleed in private. The doorbell rang. Dana entered with 2 takeout bags. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. She set the food on the counter and sat across from him. For a long time, neither of them said anything. Finally, Miles broke the silence. People think this is victory. Dana's voice was quiet. It's a crack, not a rebuild. He nodded once. They'll move on. I won't. She steadied him. That's why they're scared of you. He leaned back, exhaling through his teeth. No, they're scared of what happens when people with no title start realizing this isn't about me at all. She let that settle. On the other side of the city, Reynolds signed final suspension papers. His name was already fading from the command structure like it had never mattered. Trent sat in a holding cell, staring at the wall. No cameras, no defenders, just the silence of a man who finally understood he was alone. Dana packed up the untouched food. Miles finally spoke again, flat. Tomorrow, we start. She nodded. The headlines would move on, but the cost didn't. It sat heavy, real, unmoved by applause or outrage. Justice had no glamour, only residue. The courthouse steps were empty at dawn. The protest signs were gone. The news vans had rolled out overnight. All that remained were damp patches on the concrete and the faint ghost of chance that had once rattled the walls. Miles walked down the steps alone. No entourage, no cameras, just the morning air cutting through the silence. He stopped where it had begun, where Trent's voice had snapped through the night, where the weight of a badge had been used like a weapon. He stood there, hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on nothing. Behind him, the city kept moving. Sirens, traffic, distant arguments, life returning to the same streets that had almost buried him. Reynolds' resignation letter had hit the networks at midnight. The mayor's office had called it an opportunity for reform. Trent's arraignment was set. No uniforms, no shield, just a man facing charges. The department scrambled to distance itself from its own rot. But Miles didn't smile. The system had cracked, not collapsed. Dana appeared at the top of the stairs. They're already trying to control the narrative. I know. They'll make it about one man, one bad apple. He didn't turn. They always do. She descended the steps and stood beside him. No speeches, no press, just the 2 of them and the cold air. He finally spoke. It's never about one man. It's the hand that holds the badge, the silence that watches it, the paper that excuses it. She looked at him. Then we make it about all of them. He exhaled slowly, the breath visible in the chill. That's the work. In the distance, the sun cracked the horizon. It didn't wash the city clean. It didn't bring peace. It only exposed what was already there. Every crack, every shadow, every truth. The courthouse doors behind them creaked open. Reporters would come soon. Statements, briefings, another storm. But in this moment, there was quiet reckoning. Miles adjusted his tie. His voice was low, steady. No more silence. Dana nodded once. They walked down the final steps, not toward an ending, but into the long war beneath the headlines. The case was over. The story wasn't,